Giles Bethule, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So the thing that I wanted to start with is the name for your Instagram page. Your Instagram handle is Cast and Lane, which is very beautiful and simple. It seems to me to have that traditional feel of like an old mill house, which you see is kind of like still common today when people, there's, Marling and Evans, Spier and Mackay. So I wanted to know from the start kind of what motivated you to title your Instagram Cast and Lane.
Yeah, so the handle is also the name of the brand, which is also Cast and Lane. It comes from the street on which I lived when I conceived the brand, which is Castellane Road. It's in a neighborhood called Maida Vale, which is in West London. I happen to live in a building called Castellane Mansions, and I derived Cast and Lane from Castellane. It added this credibility and I would say English sensibility to it that Castellane alone otherwise lagged, not least because Castellane was already taken. It's the name of a hedge fund. So I didn't want to pay too much in SEO to try and bring my company first on top of a well-endowed hedge fund.
So you said that Cast and Lane conjoined together lends your brand a sense of credibility. What did you mean by that?
I think the natural association with having two English sounding names is that this is a long-standing brand. They're two business partners. They've been at it for many years, perhaps inherited it from generations and generations of family in the industry. We've got the Cast family, we've got the Lane family, and they've been doing business together for a long time. I mean, you said it yourself, you're associated with historic mills, and that's very much the intention. I happen to be lucky that I could derive Cast and Lane from Castellane, but that's what I mean about credibility. I mean, any name will gain credibility over time, to be honest, once the product proves itself, the customer service and so on. But I think right out the gate, Cast and Lane sounds like a brand that's been around for some time, in my opinion. That's just my opinion.
So I definitely want to spend some time a little bit later talking about your namesake company. But for now, I wanted to focus in particular on your Instagram, which, as you likely know, I am a massive fan of. I think I've been following you guys from the beginning, as I was saying before we started the interview, rather before we started recording the interview. I was going down through all of the photographs on your Instagram page, and I saw that I had actually liked the first one. And I think what really draws me into your Instagram and why I love it as much as I do is that you seem to have a preoccupation with early 80s to early 90s style. Seems like most of the photographs on your Instagram are from that era. So I want to spend some time talking about that. But first, I wanted to get a sense of where it is that you actually get these photographs from.
Yeah, so I'll answer the latter question immediately. I have been buying and selling and of course collecting magazines for the best part of 6 years now. Interestingly, I started with contemporary titles and issues before working my way backwards, but I've been doing this for a long time, well, relatively speaking, and I work and source for some of the best known booksellers in this domain globally. So that's been a passion of mine for some time, and it presents a natural source of material for the page. So that's where those images come from. They come from my personal collection of books and magazines. Well, 98% rather, I should say, of the images come from there. The other 2% come from Pinterest, Tumblr, and other Instagram pages that I like. Of course, I give credit where it's due. But I would say by and large, the images that I scan myself or take photos on my phone, whatever makes most sense. But yeah, they very much belong to the pages of my collection.
That's fascinating to me. I don't know that I've ever met someone who is a book or magazine collector. So how did you get involved or interested in that in the first place?
It's a long journey. I became involved in it in my second year of university here in London. There's a magazine called Another Man, which is a well-known contemporary fashion magazine. And in 2016, they had a special edition of their, I think it was I'm tempted to say October issue, and they had Harry Styles, previously of One Direction, and they had 3 different covers of Harry Styles photographed by Alistair McLellan, who's one of the best known photographers in London. And that magazine sold out in about 3 hours or something, and I happened to have bought a couple of copies of it. And I saw them going on eBay for astronomical prices. And I thought, as a student who was already broke, naturally, as all students are, I saw an opportunity to change my financial position. And I went around London and bought every issue I could find. I mean, that sold out, but thankfully some booksellers still had some stock in the back room. So I just begged and pled with them and bought all of them, resold them on eBay. And that really inspired me to start buying and selling magazines generally, because I hadn't realized there's an underbelly of people online who really love this stuff and savor it. But through buying and selling, to be honest with you, Barry, I became fascinated with this stuff myself. So it became less of a trade and more of a passion, and something that I became curious about. I gravitated towards beauty from a young age. So I guess it makes sense that I gravitated towards these magazines. And then over time, I've worked my way backwards, but that's very much where it started with the contemporary titles.
You said something fascinating there. You said from a young age, you gravitated towards beautiful, which is an absolutely beautiful phrase. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I remember, I must have been 4 years old or so, and my grandfather had a battered old copy of GQ, and there had a Porsche 911 in there, and I was obsessed with Porsche 911s, and I would try and re-sketch the car every day until I got it right. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, even at that age, I was fascinated with well-built things that at least I found attractive. And over time, that translated into other modalities of beauty, whether that's fashion, that's architecture, that's, whatever it may be. But I guess from a young age, I just saw nice things and I was drawn to them. They lured me in.
So you also said something very interesting concerning your magazine interests, which is that you started with contemporary magazines and then you started to work backwards. So what motivated you rather to do that?
Yeah, so as I established my buying and selling trade, I met lots of people along the way, people who became sources for me, people from whom I would buy to then resell. And one gentleman I met actually lived in Maida Vale as well. And he still has the most fabulous collection of men's fashion magazines that I've ever seen in my life. Is some of the rarest, most sought after copies really in the world. I mean, I think some of them, he must perhaps be the only one still with those issues. And he kindly, allowed me to look at them, study them, browse them, sometimes keep them. And actually the way we'd met, I should add, is I was selling some issues on eBay and he happened to bid on them. And then when he saw where I lived, he said, "Oh, hey, you actually live 5 minutes down the road from me. We should meet up." So that was just
a beautiful coincidence.
Yeah, it was a beautiful coincidence. And he showed me his extensive collection of magazines from the 70s, 80s, 90s. And as it happens, he actually knew a lot of the major players in that world. He knew Aldo Folai, he knew Richard Avedon, or as he calls him, Dick Avedon. I guess they were on nickname terms. That's how close they were. He knew Paolo Roversi. He knew a lot of these people because he'd worked in that industry as well. So, I guess that's how he must have obtained a lot of these copies. And, he started educating me really over coffee. We had several coffees and he would educate me about this era and tell me why it was so special. and what he associates with it, with each issue. And I was so fascinated, Barry, because a lot of the images he was showing me didn't look retro, so to speak. They were still beautiful. They were still, attractive. They were still clearly well thought out, very considered. And that changed my perception of vintage magazines, because I always thought they're going to look retro. No one wants that. And suddenly I was thinking, a lot of this can work in this day and age. I mean, I would happily wear half these clothes myself in this day and age. And so I started working backwards in that direction myself. Yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to return to talking about the images on your Instagram and the style in particular. You already briefly mentioned what it was that was appealing about them, in that they felt as if they were outfits or style could be worn today and nobody would really bat an eye, as we would say. But what in particular about the style really appealed to you? Why did you focus in on this early 80s, early 90s, rather than another era? Was it something in particular about the fit or the patterns, or what was it exactly that drew you in?
Yeah, I guess because of the socioeconomic context of those periods, people were more inclined towards expressing themselves and making a statement with the way they dressed. They were less concerned with rules and propriety. I mean, some people were, of course, but by and large, people were interested in expressing themselves as individuals. They were, concerned with, do I like this? Does it suit me? And am I contributing to the broader conversation about clothing by wearing this? Whereas I think it sort of the menswear circles, so to speak, people are very concerned with, what should I wear? How should I wear it? What's right? What's wrong? What does this authority think? Can a man do this? What can I wear trainers with a suit? Et cetera, et cetera. Whereas I think back in those days, the late 70s through the early to mid 90s, it almost feels like people were out to rebel against the rules, not only as a statement in its own right, but also to say, the rules don't work for me. I like it this way, and these are my clothes, and it's my hard-earned money. So I guess I'm going to wear them the best way I can. And I think the Japanese did this especially well. I mean, other countries too, of course, but you see this a lot in Japan. You see a lot of subversion of what we now call the rules of dress or whatever. But people pull it off beautifully and effortlessly. That's another thing. I think there's a certain effortlessness that I see in those images. People didn't dress to be dressy or to be dressed up. They just dressed because you have to wear something, right? Whereas I think now there's a particular concern with being well put together. And don't get me wrong, that existed even back then. But I would say by and large, people took a more utilitarian approach to style and dress than maybe I see now. Again, within the small ecosystem that is menswear. I can't speak for the global community.
So why do you think there has been this transition to this preoccupation with correctness, if you will?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one immediate reason that comes to mind is we have more authorities now. We have more menswear bloggers and menswear journalists than ever who are concerned with, understandably, and I'm sure well-meaningly, informing men about how they should dress. But a byproduct of that is that now men don't really feel comfortable expressing themselves in a sort of organic way. It's more, is what I'm thinking of wearing aligned with what Barry says is how I should dress, right? Can I wear a Stone Island technical jacket designed for skiing, can I wear that with some high-waisted, double-pleated, wide-leg flannel trousers and some Stan Smiths? Can I do that? So I have friends who actually Google these things before even getting dressed. Whereas I think back then, I don't get the impression people were doing that. They just thought, this looks cool, so I'm going to wear it. It's cool, it's comfortable, and it's me. And that's it. That's the end of the story. Whereas I think now, because of the influx of authorities that we have, maybe people don't feel so confident, expressing themselves. They're more interested in belonging to certain subcultures, whether that's the classic menswear, pity crowd, or hype beasts, or whatever the case may be. There's less of a comfort that's coming with what works for me, and more of an interest in what do the guys say is okay,
Yeah, that kind of is striking as well. Do you think that this in part has to do with the pervasiveness of globalization? Because as you are speaking, I'm thinking, well, at a certain point in time, what a person could wear would be circumscribed by their geographical location. And so we were mentioning before I started recording that this ended up kind of developing these kind of interesting micro cultures of style that has seemed to kind of gone by the wayside with the pervasiveness of globalization, the development of the internet, and the sheer availability of all things, essentially.
Yeah.
It seems like simultaneously, because there is so much available, the question of how we should dress becomes an ever increasingly more complicated one. And I think that, taken together with the fact that there are people on social media, I don't want to say such as myself, because I've tried to avoid the dress like me, or this is how you should dress conversation, or that part of social media. But because we also have those authorities, it seems like people are more adrift than they ever have been, as far as like trying to determine how it is that they dress. And at the same time, there's all of these authorities who could tell them how they should dress. And so there's a kind of odd conformity as well.
Yeah. Well,
sorry if that was
tangled. I would, no, not at all. That's great. What I would do is I would pull from what you said, but add this. I think what's really changed, and this could be a consequence of globalization, by the way, what's really changed is that as people's incomes have gone up, clothing has become more of a luxury than it's ever been before. That's not to say luxury clothing and high fashion, etc., were not a thing before. Of course they were. But I would say the average person, I myself included, whereas in the late 70s to the early 90s, dressing was very much a necessity. It was just clothing, right? It was, I have to wear something. I'm going to school, I'm going to work, I'm going to church or whatever. I think now we've reached a point where, because our incomes are so high and our standards of living have gone up so much, we've reached a point where dressing well has become a status symbol, but that's a function of increased earning propensity and standards of living, et cetera, et cetera. So now, more than ever, people are concerning themselves with things like buying expensive clothes, just generally, full stop. There are more people than ever buying expensive clothes, but also B, making a statement through their clothing that's less about self-expression and more about, I wouldn't call it flaunting really, but it's, it's a bit like having a NetJets card. You're not flaunting per se, but having one says a lot about you. In much the same way, if you can demonstrate that, hey, I've got my shoes from St. Crispin's, that says a lot about me. But in the 70s, there wouldn't have been as many people doing those things than there are now. So I think that's just one immediate reason that comes to my mind as to why people have become more concerned with rules and belonging to these subgroups and subcultures, is that there's greater access and there's greater ease of access than there ever has been. And because of that, clothing is now an art form rather than a necessity in the way that perhaps it was 30, 40, 50 years ago.
So even though it's more of an art form, you are simultaneously suggesting that there is kind of more conformity.
I would say, and this is just my interpretation, this is not authoritative. I would say my read of, based purely on the magazine collection that I have, people back in the day used to wear clothes on two levels. One is, can I afford it? Well, one, do I like it? Two, can I afford it? Whereas now, I think actually it's kind of flipped. It's, is this expensive / is this a flex, right? There's this flexing culture that we have now. And B, is this my admission ticket to this coveted subculture that I can belong to? Whether that's a pair of Yeezys or that's an Anderson and Shepherd suit, whatever it is that floats your boat, we now have these tickets to these subgroups that you didn't really have before. I mean, I'm not saying it didn't exist at all. Of course it did. You've always had subcultures, you've always had income disparities dictating how people dress, etc. But now it's amplified to incredible levels, really. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, so I want to return once again to these photos. So there are some things that are very distinctive about it. I agree with you that there is a timelessness about them, and they are very fresh, in that a lot of the outfits that are worn in these photos could be worn today and nobody would really bat an eye. But there also seems to be interesting differences.
Yeah.
So for example, I would just point out that there's a certain acceptableness of slouchiness, if you will. So if you just note in particular, like the fit of the jackets, they all seem, at least by today's fit standards, they all seem to be a size or two too large. And I would say simultaneously, something's going on very similar with the trousers as well, excuse me. They all seem to have a break or multiple breaks, even in some of them. And they all seem to be wide legged. And even then, sometimes, a size or two too large, at least by today's standards. And I find that
I'll pause you there just very briefly, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
But this is exactly what I'm saying. So I think nowadays we're even having these conversations about how the trousers should look and how the jacket should fit, etc. Whereas back then it was just literally, I like it and it works and I can afford it. But now we sort of have this luxury of having conversations of, how wide should my turn-ups be? How should this fit? How should this sit, etc. So going back to what we were talking about not too long ago, this is the sort of thing that I'm saying, whereby back then, of course, they were slouchy, but I'm guessing it's because they liked it and they felt good in it. Whereas I think now we would be a little bit more conservative actually in our approach, because we're thinking, I don't know if I can wear this jacket because Barry might be looking at the sleeve length, or James might not approve of the suit and Converse combination that I've got going here. Whereas I think back then it was, I like it, it's cool, end of story.
Yes, it does work as an illustration of the point you're making, I suppose, and perhaps I'm not articulating this very well, at least at the moment. I guess what I'm trying to drive at as well is that in contemporary times, the trend tends to be towards a slimmer fit, whereas then it seems to have been more of a slouchy fit. So I'm just trying to get a sense of the ways in which the style of that time is distinctive, that it is, and how different it is from our style now, I suppose. So I just wanted to take a little bit of time to discuss some of those elements as you see them. I certainly get that it's an illustration of your point, but I just kind of want to think about that for a moment.
Yeah. No, that's very, very true. And I have to say, just from a personal perspective, I prefer that. I prefer the volume. I prefer the voluminous fits. I prefer the power suit, as they call it. I think Armani probably most famous, and Gianfranco Ferré as well. They probably most famously did these suits that were I guess by today's standards, frankly, quite ridiculous, but it looks beautiful. I mean, I look at those suits, I see the slouch, I see the trouser width and all this type of stuff, and I think this is masterful, truly.
See, I
Uh,
love it. I love it as well. And I have to be honest with you, it was one of the lowest moments of my life in the last year. I have to admit it. I was on eBay and I put in 80s Armani suit, and there was this black pinstripe 80s Armani suit that was going for $100. And I think he had posted it maybe like 2 days before. It was just my size. Well, I wear a 38 regular. It was a 39 regular. I was like, I could probably make that work. And then it would also be in the same flavor, so to speak, of the time, because it's just a little bit larger. The trousers were the correct size, double forward pleats, wide legged. I was like, man, I really want to get this. And I contacted the seller. I was like, I don't have the money right now. I don't get paid for another 2 wees, but if you'd be willing to hold this off, I would be greatly appreciative. And then it sold like an hour later. Oh, I was so sad. I was like, oh, that's the 80s Armani suit I've been looking for. Just this year, I actually sold, I had a Suit Supply pinstripe suit, but it was just, and this is part of the reason why I'm really fascinated with your page. I'm starting to transition out of like that preoccupation with like slimness and starting to appreciate more fits that, you know, are slouchy. But I thought that was an interesting little tidbit there.
No, it is, and I feel genuinely very sorry for you for having missed out on that suit. I think the pinstripe is even more of a power play than just, you know, a plain number. But as I was saying, I don't know if the preoccupation with slimness is necessarily a new thing. You certainly see a lot of that in the early to mid 70s. Actually, I have a few magazines from the early to mid 70s, and actually there appears to have been a preoccupation with slimness. With you had a lot of books actually back then published for men, how to look good and be fit. So I think, as someone who wasn't there, my read of the situation is, in the 70s, there was a concern with showing off your body, and this applies to both men and women. And of course, slimmer fits do that better than slouchier fits. So I think in those sort of 70s days, Studio 54, Halston, Glitz and Glam, disco days, people were very keen to show off how slim and slender or ripped or whatever they are. Whereas I think as you move towards the 80s and 90s, for one reason or another, truthfully, I don't know the reason, you move towards demonstrations of power and influence. You start to see boldness come more towards the fore. And that's boldness not just in fit and sizing, but in patterns. See a lot of striped shirts, a lot of polka dot ties, and not just any polka dot, but the biggest dots you can imagine. It's actually
exploded. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. You see the braces coming in, even the way the hair was done in a lot of these shoots. And by the way, this is really from a Western gaze. The Japanese did it kind of differently. I'll touch on that in a second. But when you look at America, you look at England, even, you look at, well, France to a lesser extent. Same goes for, well, Italy. Actually, Italy did volume very well. You have Armani, you have Versace, you have Ferre, you have, I don't know how you pronounce it, Krizia, I think is how you say it, and so on and so forth. Valentino as well. I mean, they were the masters of volume in the sort of 80s, 90s. But around this time, you have this fascination with portraying men as alpha males. And you see this in the way they do the hair. You see this in the casting of the models. They go from casting sort of slim and slender men towards casting beefy men. You know, the classic Calvin Klein 80s, 90s kind of guy, ribbed, clearly lives in the gym, etc., etc. So it's interesting how in the 80s and 90s, and early 90s, I should say, there was suddenly an increased concern with, you know, sort of emphasizing power and status. And I guess volume is one way to sort of do that subconsciously. You know, if you see a 6'2" guy wearing a big suit, pinstripe, voluminous hair, you sort of think, what a powerful person. Whereas maybe in the 70s and perhaps the 60s, I couldn't comment too much on the 60s, but perhaps they wouldn't have done that so much. So I don't know what was happening socioeconomically to drive this sudden shift towards slouchiness and towards bold expression, but that's very much what you start to see a lot of around this time.
Do you have any speculations why that might be?
Well, I know that in the 80s, this was the height of excess. This was the height of, well, you know, the fetishization of Wall Street started around this time. You have obviously the famous films set in this sort of late 80s to early 90s era. You have Wall Street, you have American Psycho. I know American Psycho was released in the late 90s, but it's sort of set in the early 90s.
Yeah.
Even The Wolf of Wall Street, which came out quite recently, is set during that time as well. So then there was the Wall Street explosion. Obviously, we have the abuse of cocaine that becomes a much bigger thing. You have what else do you have? I mean, it's a relatively happy time, right? You have the fall of the wall. You have the cessation of the Cold War. You have a few things happening during this period that probably buoyed people's spirits and made people a little bit more ebullient than they perhaps would have been in the periods prior. I would say the further away you get from the Second World War, the more expressive people became. I think that's a theory worth looking into, actually.
What features do you think were present then that are also not present now? The features of the clothing.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think people back then did high-low dressing really well. I know it's sort of coming back again, but I think for a good 10-year run between, I'd say 2009 to 2019, men kind of felt the need to silo themselves. Like, I'm either a hashtag classic menswear guy, or I'm a streetwear guy, or I'm a punk guy, or whatever. Whereas I think back then there was a much more liberal picking and choosing of, actually, I like Supreme, but I also like Chiffonelli. Why can I not put them together and see what I can come up with, right? Obviously, as far as style icons go, Princess Diana is the most famous personification of this. Senna is another one who did that well. Obviously, Armani, Caroline de Monaco, JFK Jr. You have all these icons back then who were very comfortable doing high-low really well. And that, to me, is the most striking feature of fashion in those times. People didn't think twice about mixing Patagonia with a tailor-made item. It just was a no-brainer. Whereas I think now people sort of feel like, oh, but I belong to this tribe. I don't know if I can wear this. Even if I like it and I think I can pull it off, I'm a classic menswear guy, so I have to operate within this realm. Or I'm a hype beast. I can't wear a suit. You know, suits are for the other guys. You know, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas I think back then there was more fluidity in the way people dressed. That's one of the most striking things that I see. That admittedly is slowly coming back now, but even then there's a slight resistance, just because we've had this 10-year period of being in silos and being so strictly confined to our subcultures.
I think you homed in on something that really fascinates me as well about the era. I've recently just become really, really preoccupied with, like, in particular, the 90s. And I think it's precisely what you are suggesting. It's that mix of high and low. There's a really terrific page on Instagram called, I think it's now called, originally it was called Sign Fits. but then it changed to John Feld. I don't know if you're familiar
I
with this page.
love John Feld. I'm a
I
big
love it
fan
so
of that
much.
page. Yeah,
I love it
great.
so much.
Great.
And like, since I've been following that page and going through the different outfits, I've realized that some of the outfits that struck me the most were those that were doing precisely what you're talking about here, mixing
Yeah.
high and low. So you just have, for example, Jerry Seinfeld, he's wearing a blazer with a t-shirt, jeans,
Yeah.
and then he has on sneakers,
Yeah.
which is like kind of a thing that is becoming more and more acceptable, if you will.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
like, I think that connection there really, really fascinates me, because I'm at a kind of page, or at a certain stage rather, in my style development, where I have been in that silo that you're talking about, where it's just like classic menswear, dress
Yeah.
shirt, tie,
Yeah.
sport
Yeah.
coat, trousers, dress shoes. And now I'm getting at a point where I'm just experimenting with a lot of stuff. Like it,
Yeah.
and it, to be weird, to be honest, it sounds really, really odd, but it hurt me to actually do it. I remember last week, I went to work on Friday and I was wearing a brown Hopsack sport coat. Underneath that, I had a Ralph Lauren American flag t-shirt. And then I had like high rise wide leg trousers and I think a pair of black loafers. But it
This
really,
sounds
really
great. This sounds like what Carsten Lane stands for. This is great.
No, your page has been very influential to me, of course. But it hurt me to put on that damn t-shirt with the blazer. It really, really hurt me to do that. I was like, man, I was just sitting there for like 30 minutes before I went to work. Like, does this look okay? As you're speaking to, does this look correct? Am I supposed to be wearing this shirt with this? And then I just got to a certain point. I was just like, fuck it. Like, just wear the thing to work. There's like 5 people that you work with. If they're not going to say anything, because they all dress very tech bro, like, and if you don't like it, just don't wear it again. Like, what's the big deal? And then it turns out I did that and I love it. And now I've been like really fascinated with trying to find like vintage shirts from the 80s and 90s to actually mix in with my style.
Yeah. No, actually, it's so interesting. You're explaining this narrative you had in your mind, because that's what I was sort of guessing at, that back in the 80s and 90s, I think that's how people approached it, Barry. It was sort of like, just fuck it. Like, I like it. I think it suits me. I'm just going to wear it. Whereas I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you had 2 voices in your head. One was, I feel like trying this on, and I think it's going to work, and I'm curious to do it, and it's in my wardrobe. So let's see if it works. And then you had the other side of you that's like, no, you can't possibly wear a graphic t-shirt. That's so juvenile, etc., etc. And it's sort of this wrestling internally that's happening. And I think you didn't have that so much back in the 80s, 90s, whereas now we have a lot of that, because the authorities have done a fabulous job of, sort of teaching us that, a gentleman must do this, a gentleman can't do that, etc., etc. And so now you just have these voices stuck in your head. But I think historically you wouldn't have had that so much.
I see. Apart from the high-low aspect, what else do you think is prominent in the style at the time that isn't prominent now?
Well, I guess it's sort of connected to high-low, and to be honest, it's been a thing even in contemporary dressing for a while now. But there was a lot more prominence of sportswear in everyday clothing than there perhaps has been, at least amongst men. I know women have definitely driven the athleisure revolution that we've seen for the best part of 10 years now. But I would say even men, sort of defaulted to sneakers than they did loafers. I mean, of course, you have different subsets. You have the preppies, you have these, you have that. But I would say by and large, people felt more at ease in casual clothing than in sort of dressy clothing. That's what I see a lot of, even when I look at photo shoots that incorporate elements of classic menswear. And the Japanese do this brilliantly. You see this inclination towards a pair of joggers, a blazer, an Oxford shirt, a tie, some loafers, and some sports socks, right? Which, when I put it like that, maybe sounds peculiar, But when you see it, it's like, this is brilliant. This is great. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily wear it, but I think it's fabulous. And on the right person, it looks great. But there was this consistent, effort to bring sportswear into everything people did. So I think you have high-low dressing, you have the prevalence of sportswear, you have, I'm trying to think of things that were more prominent back then than now, because there are a few things that were big even back then, but less so now. You have more unisex dressing, actually. I see a lot of, I guess, androgynous style, if you will. I don't know if that's politically correct at this point, but you have a lot more unisex comfortability than we have now. Again, going back to what I said earlier, that the litmus test seems to have been, do I like it? Do I think it works? And can I afford it? Whereas now I think our litmus test, as I've said before, seems to be, is this proper? Is this within the rules? And is this acceptable? So if you look at the first, sort of litmus test, if I like something and I can pull it off and I can afford it, I guess it doesn't matter whether it says women's or men's, right? Because I like it, I can pull it off and I can afford it. Whereas I think if you look at the latter test that we now use a lot more frequently, it's, is this proper? Is this acceptable? And will I fit in? Well, naturally, if you say, well, I'm a man, I identify as a male, and if I wear women's clothing, then it's like, well, that's not proper. That's not going to help you fit in. That's not acceptable. A gentleman shouldn't do that. You see what I mean? So yes. I think historically you had men being much more comfortable wearing clothing, denoted as women's wear than we do now. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating that we go back to that, but I'm just saying that's an observation that I have.
That almost seems, without getting too deep into these politically incorrect waters, shall we say, that seems almost ironic, because we're at a certain time when, perhaps more than any other, at least in last 100 years, we're very confused about gender and the way that it relates to how people dress. We'll just go ahead and leave that one there, I suppose. So before we go, I definitely wanted to spend quite a bit of time talking about your company, Cast and Lane, as opposed to merely your Instagram. So what inspired you to start a clothing company? Perhaps we should put it that way.
Well, I've been fascinated with clothing for a long time, since I was 12, I would say. That's when I had my fashion awakening, if that's a thing. I was utterly obsessed with streetwear. I guess a lot of people start there, but ever since then, clothing has been a big part of my life. I've gone through different phases. I think I've graduated across all the different subcultures, from streetwear to preppy to classic menswear to all sorts of other things. And I've aspired for a long time to start my own fashion brand. As it happens, I actually wanted, when deciding where to go to university, etc., I wanted to go to study architecture and then work in fashion, because two of my idols, so to speak, Tom Ford and Virgil Abloh, did that. They studied architecture and they went into fashion. So as a young 15-year-old, that's exactly what I wanted to do as well. But my family were quite conservative and made it clear that would not happen. So I ended up studying law. But even during that period, as I alluded to, I was buying and selling magazines. But even before that, from the age of 16, I was buying and selling clothes on eBay. I was a reseller. That's really one of the main catalysts of my understanding and appreciation of so many different styles, because I was buying and selling, everything from the classic menswear stuff to streetwear to the sort of more Japanese, and the French workwear styles and so on and so forth. I was just looking for different opportunities to make a profit, frankly. As a teenager, that's pretty much the driver of a lot of your decisions. But through that, I learned a great deal. And when the pandemic hit, I was stuck at home, like so many of us, and I'd never had more time than then to really think about it and put my best foot forward. And that's when I started working on Cast and Lane.
So what do you guys offer currently? I know because I've obviously looked at your page, but for those who might not know, what do you offer?
Well, the shirt that I'm wearing is a chambray blue version of the Four Seasons shirt, which is the first product we offered. Right now, the Four Seasons shirt comes in white, navy, and this chambray blue. We have one graphic t-shirt in two colors. It's called the Municipalities t-shirt. It's in white and it's in navy. And we have a dad hat called the Mariner hat, which is inspired by the hats that the America's Cup teammates used to wear back in the 80s and 90s, and in fact, even in the 70s as well, for that matter. And in the next month or so, we're going to introduce our trouser, which is called the Weekender Trouser. We teased that a while ago, but it's finally going to be released. You should expect that in the next month or so. And we're also going to release some Oxford shirts. So the Cast and Lane interpretation of the Oxford shirt. So you can expect that in the coming weeks.
Talk to me about that trouser. I'm fascinated. You called it the Weekender?
Yeah, I called it the Weekender.
So why the title, and then talk about some of the features?
So the way I sort of conceive the collections, as it were, of the brand, you have the Four Seasons, which are pieces that I believe can be really worn throughout the year. I mean, technically anything can be worn throughout the year. It's your clothes, do whatever you want with them. But these are pieces that are very much intended for four-season wearability, so to speak, hence the name. Whereas the Weekender stuff, while it also remains wearable throughout the year for reasons I just said, are very much pieces that I see being worn on a weekend. They're much more dressed down, they're much more relaxed, much more casual. So you'll see the graphic t-shirt is a Weekender type thing. I don't imagine too many offices are accommodating of graphic t-shirts, but maybe that says a lot about the industry I work in full time.
Yes, it certainly does, because I can say that is not the case in academia in the United States, put it that way.
There you go. But the trousers, I love them. Of course, I wouldn't sell anything I don't like. They are high rise, they're wide leg, pretty wide leg opening, not Japanese wide, but pretty wide by Western standards, if you will. I'd say it's about a 9-inch leg opening, straight cut, double pleated, belt loops, no side adjusters, and yeah, I think they're going to be beautiful. They're made from pretty robust. It's about 320 grams per square meter cotton drill fabric. I don't expect people to know the technicalities of fabric weights, but as far as casual chino type trousers go, that's pretty heavy, and that's pretty robust. Yeah.
I'm fascinated. I'm probably going to pick up a pair unless they're $1,000. I don't know if I can do 1,000.
It won't be, and I would encourage you to. I think if you like the older Armani styles, I think you'll love these. Yeah, they are quite similar. They're not the same. They're quite similar to. So Ralph Lauren back in the 80s and 90s had these trousers called the Andrew trousers, which were wildly popular, and for some unknown reason they discontinued them. And our trousers are quite similar to those. They're not the same. They're made from a different material, and the cut is different. It's wider. But if you want a decent reference point, you can look at the Andrew trousers, which they've discontinued.
Okay. So as far as like other products, do you have any other products on the horizon?
Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff coming later in the summer and sort of earlier in autumn. I won't go into too much detail at this point. I don't want to jinx anything. I've already had enough production troubles being a small brand, but you know, the ethos is really the same. The images that I post on Instagram serve, I would say, three purposes. One is, this is what I like and this is what inspires what I do. Two, and this is something all brands do, but I suppose not too many brands publicize it, but these are my reference points, right? I think at this point it's well documented. There isn't much that's new in fashion. A lot of it is just different people's interpretations of things that already exist. And this is to say, this is what informs my interpretation. And then 3 is to just allow other enthusiasts, such as yourself, to draw inspiration for their personal style or whatever personal projects they might be working on. So those are the 3 primary purposes. And I would say for a good sense of what's coming and what's in the pipeline for Cast and Lane, the Instagram page is the biggest giveaway.
That makes me extremely excited. So that's, you kind of segued into the next question that I was going to ask you, which is that, like, where do you see your kind of like guiding aesthetic vision going in the future? But I think you've kind of addressed that here. Expect to see.
Yeah. And I would say, look, again, not to romanticize the past, because there's so many things that were wrong with the past as well. But I would say if you look at the old J. Crew, old Ralph Lauren, old The Gap, old Land's End, all of those give you a good sense of where I'm trying to take this. By and large, those brands still exist, but the reality is they're so far removed from what they used to be that I don't feel particularly comfortable saying I would like to build the next J. Crew, because J. Crew today is so different to what it used to be. If you have any doubts about that, there's a good Instagram page called Lost J. Crew, which shows you what J. Crew used to be. And you can open 2 tabs, Lost J. Crew and jcrew.com today, and you'll see the difference. I'm not saying it's better or worse, different individuals have different preferences, but I would say as far as what really inspires me the most, again, without romanticizing history, it's those 80s, 90s, Ralph, J. Crew, The Gap, Land's End, etc., J Press, and so on. That's really the vision for my brand. And I'd say as far as aesthetic goes, it's really the high-low that I mentioned earlier. I really would like to get that right, and hopefully inspire many people to feel comfortable wearing graphic t-shirts underneath tailored sports jackets.
Speaking my language. Yeah, that Lost J. Crew Instagram page, I follow that one as well. I really love it. It's another one of those small Instagram pages that I really just adore.
Yeah, I'm a big fan, and I am very envious of whoever runs that, because those old J. Crew catalogs, take it from me, are extremely expensive and extremely rare. So to have so many of them, I have no idea how they did it. I've been collecting books and magazines in fashion for 6-7 years, and I have never seen them for a decent price. So kudos to them.
Well, if they happen to be watching this, contact my man Giles. Alrighty, so I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. I just want to say thank you very much for coming on and speaking to me. I know that it's getting a little bit late there in England. I'm very, very excited for what the future of Cast and Lane will be. I'll definitely make sure to keep an eye on that. And I'm going to pick up a couple of your shirts. I'll probably pick up the 4 Seasons and also that graphic tee so I can wear it under my tailoring.
Super. That's what I love to hear. No, thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate you, first and foremost, supporting the brand and the vision, and for being a long-standing follower on Instagram. I see all the likes and I see all the comments, and you are one of the most prominent followers that I have. So I'm very grateful for that, and of course for being on your page. That's fabulous. Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate that.
I am a prolific liker of your photos, I will say.
Sure, and I appreciate every one of your likes. So please keep coming.
All right. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks very much.